capacity assessments, they can happen at 2 different points of the implementation science. So if you refer back to your implementation science crash course, you know that there are 4 parts to the implementation science: the exploration phase, the installation phase, the partial implementation phase, and then the full implementation phase. When it comes to capacity assessment, you would be looking at the exploration phase. So like maybe you have selected a new practice and you're trying to ask yourself if your particular program or school has the capacity to do that practice from the start. Or you can use capacity assessment at the partial implementation phase, where you have already started to put the practice into place, but maybe you're not getting the results that you thought you were going to get, or maybe you're not getting, you know, it's just not going as well as it should have because you put it through the hexagon tool, you picked the program that, you know that the program next door is using or the school next door is using, and they're having really great success with it, and somehow it's just not working for you. So a capacity assessment at that point in time would be really useful to figuring out, you know, what are the pieces that are missing so that you can actually get that program to respond and to like produce the results it is that you were aiming for it to produce from the start. So just a couple of things to think about in terms of capacity assessment. Okay, and going on to the next slide, Nicole, I think it's slide 8 in the companion guide. I'm not sure. It's the one that has the link to the NERN website to it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, and so the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill NERN site actually has 4 different types of capacity assessments that they offer. And each one obviously does something a little bit different, but the general premise is basically the same. We're actually only going to be talking about today about the driver's best practices assessment. You'll notice on the screen that there is a state capacity assessment. Now that might be something that Nicole and I might do with our colleagues up here in Augusta, where, you know, we might even get like the commissioner's office involved and get like the different legislative representatives involved, and to really look at whether the state of Maine actually has the pieces in place that it needs to be able to provide schools with support in MTSS, or provide schools with support in running their programming and federal compliance and like all those kinds of things. Then it moves down into a regional capacity assessment. And the regional capacity assessment actually, in this case, would operate in 2 different places. The first place that it might operate would be like if a state is set up to be much more regionally driven than another state, right? So like Maine does have particular regions, I realize that, but we're not so big that we have like a regional system where, you know, some states, like say Wisconsin, for example, might have a commissioner of education, but then each of their larger regions is also going to have like a head person, right, in that region, and then that region, and then they communicate with the commissioner, and then like everybody underneath them communicates to them. Because the state is just so large, there would be no way that one person could do all of it. But the other way that a regional capacity assessment could be used is if you thought of the state of Maine as not just a state, but as a region, right? This might be the type of assessment that, say, a different team at the department level might want to do to make sure that they're capable of meeting whatever that team's goals are. So Nicole and I sit on a smaller team at the department called the early learning team. And so the early learning team might want to look at completing a regional capacity assessment to make sure that our team actually has the capacity to provide the supports in early childhood teaching and learning that we would need to provide. Or like for me, being part of the MTSS team, like I might have my MTSS team look at the regional capacity assessment and ask the questions of, does this particular smaller level team actually have the capacity to provide the supports in the state of Maine in MTSS? The district capacity assessment is going to be one that is pretty self-explanatory. It's going to be at your school board level. It's going to be at your superintendent level, like that district office level. regional, like school union level, SAD level, like whatever it is, AOS, whatever type of system it is that you're coming from. And then the driver's best practices assessment is actually going to be more school driven, right? So this is going to be the one that is going to be conducted at an individual school level, so that you can look at what are the pieces of that particular school's capacity to run the programs that it has in place and to put the programs that it has in place. And so that's the one that we're going to focus on primarily today. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, which is number 9 in your companion guide, and I'm not sure what slide it is. Looks like 85 if you're following along with the slide deck. So when would you use a capacity assessment? We kind of went over this a few minutes ago, but you would use it when you are already using a practice and you want to figure out like why the results you're getting are not the expected results, and or when you have selected a new practice and you want to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place. So we did cover that, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that one. Okay, and so the purpose of a capacity assessment really has 4 primary purposes. Nicole, if you want to go to the next slide. Yep. So there are 4 primary purposes for doing the work and taking the time to complete a capacity assessment. And the first is that it's an opportunity for you to really identify the strengths and the weaknesses or / areas of improvement within your program, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about like the criteria of a good capacity assessment, but the purpose for doing it is so that you can really put down concretely on paper through a thinking process what the strengths are that you're bringing to the table, and then what are the areas that we already know need improvement before we even start to implement this new thing or implement this new program or revamp or rescale up this program. The second purpose behind a capacity assessment is to give you the power to be able to select the tools that you need to increase your capacity for implementation of that program. So again, it's going to be that process that you go through that's going to show you like, oh, well, you want to make, pizza for dinner, but you don't have any yeast, you don't have any pizza crust, right? If you don't have any access to like the base of the pizza, you really don't have pizza. You have something else, but you don't necessarily have, like pizza if you're looking for like a traditional crust pizza. It's the same when you're looking at putting together a program in your buildings, right? If you want to put a program together that requires, every single student to have a 1-to-1 laptop ratio, but you don't have a 1-to-1 laptop ratio, so you're not going to want to pick that program, right? Even if it's the best program, top program, and everybody around you is already using it. Like if you don't have the capacity to be able to put it into place with Fidelity, it's not worth doing, and that might sound like a little bit of tough love there, but it's really not. So you would want to know those things going into it so that you could be prepared to put that program in place with Fidelity, because Fidelity is generally it's the crux. It's like where it's really and truly where things fail or where things succeed is with that Fidelity measure. The third purpose behind a capacity assessment and a good reason for doing it is that it allows you to develop an action plan for where you want to go next with your programming. And the next slide will explain a little bit more about how you would use a capacity assessment to create that action plan. But it's really, it's like that checklist. It's a checkpoint for you to say, okay, well, I have this, this, and this. I need this, this, and this. And then, so now I know like what I have to do next. We spend a lot of time, I think, as professionals, especially as professionals in education, where we talk a lot about theory and we talk a lot about the things that we know are best practices. We talk a lot about the things that we know we should do for our schools and for our students. But sometimes our actions either are not swift enough to be able to get the benefits of what it is that we're trying to do, or our actions don't actually match the need. And that's not for lack of, but it's not for being like irresponsible with your time or with your effort. It's just that sometimes we don't always know the root cause of something. And so the actions that we put into place, unless they match as succinctly as possible, you're not going to get those results that you're looking for. So a capacity assessment allows you to come up with that action plan so you know which steps to take and where you're going next. And then the other purpose for utilizing a capacity assessment is that it is like a universal screener. So once you have put a capacity assessment into place and you've done it the first time, you can actually use that same assessment periodically throughout a period of time. So if it's your first implementation year, for example, of a new program, then you would conduct a capacity assessment periodically throughout that first year to allow you to monitor that progress over time, right? And so it's going to be sensitive enough that when something is missing, the capacity assessment can catch that before something that's small turns into something catastrophic, right? Where you've gone so far down a path that it's going to take hours and hours and dollars to get you out of that hole or out of that failure, right? And so a lot of places will take these assessments and they'll use them as a universal screener. They'll use them as a progress monitoring tool so that you can track how it's going and whether the response that you're getting is the response that you are actually going for. So they serve a couple of different, really important purposes and make them, worth the time and effort that it takes to put them into motion. If we go to the next slide, 87 in the slide deck or 11 in the capacity or in the companion guide rather, you'll notice that we're going to talk next briefly about the criteria that a good quality capacity assessment will have. And these are important because NERN is not the only agency, I guess, maybe is the word that I've been trying to find, that puts out a capacity assessment. Even some of the programs that you might be currently using or looking to take on might even have like a getting ready checklist or a readiness checklist or something like that. But we know that that we need something that's going to be usable and is going to be relevant for what it is that we're trying to do. And it could be, so there are lots of places that you can start to get those checklists and ask those questions. And so the NERN one is really just, it's just one example of a capacity assessment. But I like the NERN one over many of the others that I've seen, simply because they do contain these 4 criteria. And I do consider for myself, these to be like the cream of the crop in terms of the criteria that you would want a capacity assessment to have. So if you chose to use a different assessment, it would be helpful knowing these criteria so that you would know how to go about a process of selecting a quality capacity assessment. And so the first thing that you're looking for is obviously relevancy, right? Is that capacity assessment going to have the key indicators that you're looking for? Is it going to have the look fors? You're looking for this, not this. You're listening for this, not that. And is the capacity assessment going to offer you multiple access points to monitoring your progress and to finding actionable points so that you can improve your progress? And so relevancy to your target, to your goal, and to the programming itself is a really important part of a good capacity assessment. The second criteria is that the assessment needs to be written so that it is sensitive. And what I mean by sensitive is that it's designed to be able to spot even minor changes in capacity as they happen. Because again, as we talked about a few minutes ago with the purpose of doing a capacity assessment, if you're going to do it, you want to do it well. And you want to know that the time and the effort that you're putting into the process of capacity assessment is going to get you the results that you're looking for, right? And so you need something that is going to be responsive and sensitive enough so that when something is not going right, you can catch it before it goes so far down the road of not being right. And this makes sense if you think about it, because that's exactly what we try to do with our students in our classrooms, right? So like when we notice the student is starting to show, you know, that they need additional assistance with something, or if they're not learning something, you know, in the way that you were hoping for them, or they're, you know, they're showing signs that they need support, we would swoop in and hopefully give them the right amount of support at the right amount of time. It's the same thing with a capacity assessment. You want it to have the right amount of support at the right amount of time, so that you'll know how to make changes quickly before they so that little things don't become big things. The third criteria for a quality capacity assessment is that it's consequential. And what I mean by that is that it's meant to have components of it and guidance that you can apply immediately, right? So if we think of every behavior having a consequence, or every behavior having some kind of outcome, and speaking on the idea that a consequence isn't necessarily a negative thing, it's just the thing that happens after a behavior, right? It could be positive, could be negative, could be neutral. But when it comes to the completing that assessment, you want to know that whatever happens immediately after that is something that is going to be usable and actionable and able to be put into place so that it's beneficial to you. The very last thing that you would want to do is spend all of this time vetting a new program, or vetting, you know, a program that's already in place, just to feel like you didn't get anywhere at the other side of it, because we're all tired, we're all stressed, and we've got too many other things to do than waste our time trying to use a tool like this just to feel like you didn't get anywhere, right, on the other side of that. So you want there to be consequences that come after the behavior of doing the assessment that gets you closer to your goal. And then the fourth criteria is that it's practical, right? Well, clearly we are all strapped for time. We all have very low levels of mental energy, especially in April, heading into May. And we want to know that the time that we're going to take to do something is not only going to be beneficial and relevant, but that the thing in itself is not going to take a lot of time to learn how to do, not a lot of time to train how to do, and not a lot of time to actually implement. Because anything that is going to take up too much of your time is not helping you, because A, it's just using up precious amounts of energy that, you know, that are already in short supply, and then B, it could be taking away time from our students, right, and time from our programs, where we would want to be putting that time and effort, whatever time and effort that we have, into those folks, instead of putting them into some, you know, fruitless endeavor to try to figure something out and then feel like you didn't get anything out of it. So practical is another primary criteria for a good quality capacity assessment. We're going to go ahead and skip the next slide, because I think I've already covered it in most of the conversation so far. And then what we'll do now is we're just going to go over really quickly about the capacity assessments the capacity assessment and its different components that we're going to talk about today. And then I'm going to stop talking for just a couple of minutes so that folks can, you know, take a break from my voice, but also get their materials organized so that you'll know where we're headed over the course of the next few slides. So the next few slides, what we're going to do is we are going to be taking a closer look at the actual document that is the driver's best practices assessment. And we'll go over a few of its pieces, but you know, to go over it in depth would have made for probably its own training. I think Nicole would agree that once we get into it, you realize that it's quite extensive. But we are going to review it today. We're also going to look at the scoring aspect of the capacity assessment, the results and next steps aspect of the capacity assessment, and then the Fidelity Checklist that comes along with the capacity assessment. So the driver's tip sheet is the first document that we are going to go over today. And so when we're thinking about implementation science, right, or the 4 aspects of implementation in that implementation science crash course that you were given at the beginning of this training series, there are 3 primary components or drivers that direct the implementation process, okay? And so those 3 drivers are leadership, organization drivers, and competency drivers. And just to kind of bring us back to our framing of this process, the leadership drivers really are a lot of those pieces that we talked about in week 1. It's that self-identification. It's that leadership of an MTSS. It's the leadership of programming and the things that go into that leadership process. And so that in itself is its own driver. Like, the leadership is so important that it takes on its own level of importance in terms of an implementation driver. The organization drivers, if you see on the right-hand side of that triangle on the screen, that's going to be your resources. It's going to be all of that resource mapping that we talked about. It's going to be your human resources, your facilities. It's going to be all of those things that come along with the organization itself, right? So the people and the things and the time that are already like incorporated into the organizational structure of whatever type of program that it is that you're coming from, whether it's a classroom, whether it's a school, or whether it's like an early childhood setting. That left side of the triangle on your screen are the competency drivers. And it's the competency drivers, which is where a capacity assessment and a hexagon tool actually fit into those implementation drivers. And so you'll notice on that left-hand side of the triangle, there are some categories. So there's the selection category, a training category, a coaching category. There's a fidelity category at the very top, or the apex of the triangle. And then your capacity drivers are going to start to spill over a little bit into organization, but really, that's where by the time you get to like systems intervention, you're starting to move away from capacity and you're moving into that organizational driver piece. And so today we're going to live basically on that left-hand side of the triangle. So selection, training, coaching, and fidelity, right? And so what you're looking at here with the driver's tip sheet is basically a resource that breaks down what each of the sub-drivers means when thinking about a capacity driver, right? And so for selection, for example, on this particular tip sheet, there's a section that explains to you about the process of selecting and what are the skills and abilities and prerequisites that a leader or a team might need in order to make selections in their program that are as powerful and relevant as possible, right? And so the selection piece is everything from the programs that you select to the people that you select to work in your program, right? The ones that you hire to come and fill a particular role. And what are the foundational components of participating in a selection process. And then if you look down on the next page, you'll see that there are some best practices for selection. And so that's the way this driver sheet actually breaks down. So it takes each of the items on that competency driver side of the triangle and gives you an explanation about each of the categories, and then gives you some best practices which are basically like your look-fors for that part of the capacity driver. So the next one would be training, right? And so this explains, to you the purpose of training, talks about adult learning versus, student learning, and what are the basic qualities of a training program. And then it goes on to give you some tips for best practices in terms of training. So whether it's coaches, whether it's, train the trainer opportunities, or whether it's bringing in other trainers, to provide that service for you. But it gives you a really good sense of like that training component of a competency driver. And then also, this is going to speak directly to fidelity, right? So your training opportunity is going to line up directly with how well you are able to offer a program or a practice with fidelity. Moving on down to page 5, you'll see that there is a segment for the coaching category of competency driver. And the coaching is basically going to be, an explanation of what good quality coaching is as defined by NERN, right? Because these are NERN products that we're looking at. But then underneath all of that, it gives you some best practices to look for that coaching aspect of it. Going down a little bit farther, we'll see that fidelity is the next category of the competency driver. And I found it interesting because I didn't say this in Monday either. So Nicole, I tend to sometimes give extra things to the Wednesday group because I come across things in between Monday and Wednesday. But just last night, I was doing some reading for a project that I'm doing. And a line that struck me was, you know, I often get asked as the MTSS person, and I know Nicole is asked to this a lot in her work of, just tell me the right intervention, or just tell me the right thing to do. What is the thing I should be putting my focus on? What is the thing I should be using? And this particular line in this article that I was reading was, you know, the hard truth of the matter is this: it's never about the actual intervention. It's about how well that intervention has been put into place with Fidelity. And so if you read nothing else on this tip driver sheet, I would highly implore you to read the Fidelity section, because you could be picking a program that is sitting on a shelf that is long forgotten and full of dust, and someone used it years ago and said, I used that once and it didn't work. Maybe it didn't work because the program didn't work, or maybe it didn't work because the fidelity to implement the program wasn't as robust as it needed to be to make the program work. Because in this particular article that I was reading, I mean, it was something ridiculous. Like 90% of the programs that fail because of a lack of fidelity, and not because the students are unable to learn or that the students were unable to respond. And so the fidelity piece is huge when it comes to this, and it's certainly a huge component of a well-functioning MTSS. So if you take nothing away from today, I want you to spend some time reading through and internalizing the fidelity piece and the fidelity best practices of the tip driver sheet. Moving on down the sheet onto page 9, you have the decision and support data system. Again, because MTSS is a data-informed decision-making system, understanding how you use the data to support your system is vitally important, so that you can be making the right predictions, and you can be making your best hypotheses as to why something's root cause is what it is, so that you can then match the correct resource or match the correct approach to rectifying or remedying you know, whatever it is that you've come up against, or the thing that it is that you're trying to fix. And so the data support and data system, decision support and data system aspect is one of those competency drivers that you have to know that your data is, you should look at data with a question in mind, and rather than looking at the data hoping to answer like a question that you haven't asked yet. Because remember, data can say basically whatever it is that you want it to say. So, and we often find ourselves in that situation where, you know, we have a data set because we wanted to collect some data, and then we sit down to look at the data to see what the data is going to tell us, but we haven't actually asked it, or we haven't asked the question, what it is that we're trying to find in this data specifically. And so the data support, decision support and data system is another one of those drivers or categories of a capacity driver that are super important. And then of course on page 10, there are best practices. And then we have, looking at page 11, the facilitative administration. Now we're starting to move back down the other side of the triangle, where we're looking at our organizational drivers and the things that have to happen in an organization. And of course, leadership of some kind, teams of some kind, all fall into that facilitative administration. So there's an explanation and some best practices for that. And then, of course, going down to the bottom, actually, I think that's the last one. Yeah, I did say that we were going to go partly down that right side. So this sheet is an excellent resource for you as you are looking at those primary components of the drivers that you would want to be keeping in mind as you are looking to complete and select a program, run that program and decide if you have the capacity to do it, and then put that program into place based on the skills that you would learn by engaging in this resource. The next document that we're going to go over briefly is the Driver's Best Practices Assessment itself. And so this is the document that NERN provides that is it's everything. It's the question items, it's the scoring rubric, it's the next steps and planning document, and it's the it is the thing that you do. It's the thing that you spend your time assessing and going over. And so you were actually given a couple of different documents that breaks it down into a couple of different segments. So we are going to take it segment by segment. But the first thing that I would encourage you to do is, as you flip through the driver's best practices assessment, and you stop on the table of contents, there's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out to keep in mind as you are considering this particular assessment as something you might want to use in your program. And that is that you'll notice that there is a pretty strict, I guess, or structured rather, administration process of this capacity assessment. And so you'll notice here that you need some different players in order to make this done and get it done with Fidelity. So there needs to be a facilitator, there needs to be a note taker. You'll have the participants that are having the conversations and that are producing the results for the assessment. And then there's actually an observer role. If we were to scroll down a little bit to page 4, it breaks down a little bit more like what the criteria are for each of these individual roles. So for example, the facilitator is going to be somebody that is not only facilitating the assessment with the group of people that are participating in the assessment, but they have a considerable amount of prep work that has to be done prior to conducting the capacity assessment. And they also have to have gone through, hopefully they would have gone through a facilitation training process, and NERN actually provides that training process. So that link that I told you about earlier today that brings you to that 15 to 18-minute module, that's the training process that you would go through in order to be prepared so that you could implement this assessment with Fidelity. Again, Fidelity being the key term here, because it's really not worth doing if you're not able to administer it, with as much fidelity to the process as possible. You may as well, take your time and put it into something else. So the facilitator really has a huge role to play in this particular assessment process. The other thing to note is that the facilitator does not need to be an administrator. It can be anybody that has been trained in the administration process, that has experience with the organization, and has some sort of relationship with the respondents, right? And I would argue to also say that they have to have some kind of passion for the work that is being done as well, right? So you wouldn't just pick any facilitator out of the blue and say, here, I want you to do this, take this training course, and you're going to facilitate this. Because if they don't have a passion or a desire to want to be part of the facilitation process, you're not going to get the same results as you would for somebody that is really invested and really interested in being part of the continuous improvement process. But that does not have to be an administrator. So for those of you out there that are administrators and might be thinking, gosh, I can't even imagine having one more thing that I have to do. Take a look at the team around you. Who on your team could also be interested and capable of learning the skills and the strategies that would need to happen to put this process into place? Because it's not something that you have to take on as the administrator. The note taker is going to be another important role, because the facilitator has a very strict role that not only are they doing most of the prep work and they're prompting the progress of the assessment, but they're actually not going to be taking any of the notes, and they're not going to be doing any of the voting. So the facilitator that you choose is going to be someone that is actually not going to take part in the process, other than the fact that they're going to administer the assessment itself. Now, the note taker is another person that is going to be strictly given that one role. They will take the notes. They will be the ones that jot down the things that they hear. They'll be the ones that are doing the scoring. They're the ones that are going to be helping to summarize, some of the themes that they've heard, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be assisting with some of the action planning, right, using the notes that they took. but the note taker is not going to have a vote. So when you are going through the items in the actual capacity assessment, the way that the process goes is the facilitator, provides a question, and the participants are going to have an opportunity to think about and deliberate on that question. And then there's a voting process. And we'll talk a little bit more about the voting process when we get to scoring, because it's actually a really super important part of the capacity assessment process. So I don't want to skip it. But the note taker would not have any voting opportunities. They are not going to give their input at all. Like their sole role is to take the notes as part of the assessment process. Skipping over the participants, we're going to jump to the observer role. And the observer role might seem like, well, isn't the note taker like obviously still the observer, or isn't the facilitator also a observer? Yes, that is all true, but the observer is also another helpful role to have in the assessment process, because they're also going to be ones that are just listening and taking in and listening for the threads and the themes that come up during the facilitation, during the scoring process. And then they can also take that information and be another set of ears or another voice as you're sitting down to provide, or as you're sitting down to go through the results and figure out what your next steps are, your next action plan is. But the observer, again, is not they don't get a vote. So when you're thinking about selecting your note taker and your observer, you're going to want to make sure that when you're selecting those participants in the assessment process, that they probably already have a pretty vast amount of knowledge of whatever the specific program or practice is that you're doing the capacity assessment for, but also that they are able to come to this from a completely neutral standpoint, right? You want as much neutrality among the facilitator and the note taker and the observer as possible, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about why, again, as we get down into sort of like the facilitation part and the scoring part of the actual assessment items. Now, the participants then are basically everybody else, right? So if you are in a small program, it could be tricky actually to do a process like this, because you may want to bring someone from outside of your organization to do your facilitating, your note taking, and your observing. If you only have, say, 3 people, right, in your program, because you're going to need all 3 of those people to be participants in the process, right? And so that might be where you might reach out to, say, like the Department of Education, and you might say, hey, like we need somebody, we know we need to do a capacity assessment. We're an early childhood setting. Is there someone available to help us with this process? And that might be where like Nicole might come in, or Marcy might come in, and they might take on that role of facilitator for you, so that all of the most important people can be part of that participant process. If you're coming from a school and you're looking at it from like a grade level perspective or a whole school perspective, generally you're going to have enough people to be able to play all of these roles. But some of you come from very small schools. I know on Monday we have, or maybe not Monday, but like in other trainings I've had, like, we have folks that join us that are from like an island school, right? And there's only so many people. And so again, like even if you're in a bigger program or in a school setting, you may want to have an outside person come in to help with that facilitation process, because you're going to want as many voices in that participants category as possible. Now, the participants are the ones that are going to do the majority of the discussion, and they're the ones that are going to be doing the voting. So when you look at one of the items in the capacity assessment, they're going to be the ones that are discussing the item, considering like where their position is on whether they believe that it's fully in place, partially in place, or not in place at all. And then they're going to be the ones that are going to go through the voting process, right? So if we were to skip down, Nicole, to page, I think it's 8. Nope, not 8. My goodness. It is page 10. Where we'll just take a look at the first item in the actual capacity assessment, and that's under selection. And so the facilitator would read out to the group, there is someone accountable for the recruitment and selection of relevant staff for the program or practice. And then the facilitator stops talking. Now, at this point, your participants are going to be the ones that are thinking about that. And they're going to be thinking, well, do we have this? Is that in place? Oh, I didn't know we had that. Or gee, I'm not really sure. So they're going to be the ones that are actually thinking about and deciding and determining whether this particular item is true or not. And then when it comes to when it comes to voting, they're going to be given an opportunity to vote. So let's say there are 10 people in your participant pool, and you set this selection item out here. Number one, someone responsible for recruitment and selection, yada, yada. They have some time to think about it. And then you say, okay, ready, set, vote. And if 8 of them vote a 2, that yes, they believe that you have that item in place. If one of them votes a 1, that they believe that it may be partially in place, and one of them votes a 0, we don't have consensus here, right? And so when you're coming to a capacity assessment process, the very last thing that we're trying to do is to convince someone of something if they don't believe it already exists, okay? And when I say that, I mean that you always take the lowest score as your actual score, because your program is only as strong as its weakest link, right? And so if you have 8 people that believe it's in place, but you have this one person that either is brand new or doesn't know where to find that and never knew that existed, your program can't run with fidelity if not everybody is in the right place, right? And so while you may be able to say, oh, hey, don't forget, we talked about this, that other day, that's fine. But if that person doesn't feel like they are 100% capable of implementing that part or that item in the capacity assessment, it's still a 0 until they feel like they're fluid and know exactly how to use it, right? What you would do instead is, instead of having those folks that believe something is in place convince the others that it is actually in place, instead, you would have those that are unsure, so the ones in the 0s, give them an opportunity to say why they scored the way that they did. Well, I scored a 1 because this is what I've understood, but I didn't know that this was over here. Well, I scored a 0 because I've only been here for 2 weeks and I never received any of this in my training, right? And so at that point, what you're trying to do as a facilitator is ascertain where the weaknesses are in the people that you have around you, so that you could figure out where are those items that need to be lifted up, so that we can get your program up to a point where it can be running with fidelity. So with reviewing your results and the action planning based on the results, when you're putting together your block of time to do your capacity assessment, you're going to want the better part of 2 hours, if not even a little bit more time than 2 hours to do this particular process from start to finish. And the reason for that is you don't want to conduct the capacity assessment and then send folks off without fully understanding what the next steps are in the planning process, okay? And so what I would recommend, if it were me, is that you facilitate the capacity assessment and then maybe take a break for a lunch, or maybe you take a break for, like a bio break or a stretch break or something like that. And then during that time, the facilitator, along with the note taker and the observer, what they would do is they would go ahead and compile the information into some kind of chart, into some kind of graph, and they would get the information ready for folks to take a look at when they returned from the break, right? Because you want the input of the folks that actually participated in the assessment to also have a say in where you go next, right, with this assessment. So for this purpose, you would send them off, the participants, to take a break while you compiled the information for them to look at. As you bring them back, you're going to go through a reviewing results and action planning process, right? And so what you see here on this document are basically some prompts that you can use to help guide the conversation. And again, the facilitator has a very prominent role to play in this process because they're not actually going to be any part of the conversation there, but they are going to be the ones that are going to try to guide the conversation as best as possible to a point where there is an actionable outcome on the other side of it, right? So some of the things that you would be looking for are, not letting a conversation get too far down into any kind of rabbit hole, right? Like if one of your participants identifies a problem and they want to continue to talk about that problem and talk about it, pulling them out of that and into like a more actionable item or another prompt to think about would be an important part of that facilitation role. Because the whole point of this process, of this assessment process, is to come out with an action plan on the other side, right? And so this process here, the reviewing the results process, is where you're going to look at the data. You're going to look for trends. You're going to look for consistencies. You're going to look for inconsistencies. You're going to look at what areas exist that are already worth celebrating. What are some areas that stick out to you right off the top that you know is an area that has to get a majority of your effort, as you move forward. This is where you'll identify if there are additional training or stakeholders that you need to bring in. And so having that conversation about what the results of the capacity assessment provided to you, with the idea that before you leave the meeting or before you leave the session that you have put together with your participants, that you have an actionable plan. So if you scroll down to the second half of that page of the action planning guide, you'll see that there is like an actual template that you would fill out. So before leaving, you would set a date and a time for when something was going to be completed and when you were going to meet again. This is where you're going to take a look at all of those scores that were zeros and ones. You're going to have some commentary about that. You're going to have an opportunity to give folks even more opportunity to say like what they believe about a certain thing, what they feel may need to happen, and then thinking about like what of those items are going to need to have the most effort put into them in terms of actionable items, who is going to do it, when will it be done by, right? So you're going to actually put on paper a train of responsibility for exploring and getting, these parts of this process taken care of. You're going to look at some of the quick wins and some of the big impact items, right? Because again, I think maybe it was this group, might not have been this group, it might have been a different group that I was talking to. Sometimes you just want a quick win. Like you want to build some momentum, you want to build some rapport, you want to build some morale. And so you're looking for like something that's going to be quick, low cost, high impact, where is there a quick win that you could get to actually build buy-in and build rapport with your group? And then what are going to be the specific actions that you'll need to conduct before the next time you meet? Who will do them? Actually naming a person, who will be their buddy, right? I have found that for me, it's okay to name a particular person that's going to do something, but giving them an accountability partner goes like a whole other step of accountable, right? Because those folks can check in with each other. And so leading with a plan is going to be an integral part of this process. And then moving us along quickly, just in terms of time, to our final document, which was the Fidelity Checklist. The Fidelity Checklist is going to happen immediately before you conduct your capacity assessment with your participants. And so at this point, your facilitator, along with perhaps your note taker and your observer, those three folks are going to sit down and they're going to conduct this Fidelity Checklist. And you're looking for a plus sign in each of the boxes that are contained in the Fidelity Checklist. Because remember what I said a few minutes ago, 90% of the things that don't work out for us mostly come down to a lack of fidelity of implementation. So if you're not going to do it with fidelity, it's not worth doing. I'll say it over again. I'll say it. I'll write it on the wall. Like it's just the brass tacks of it, right? And so for this particular process, you want to go through and make absolutely sure that you have checked all of the boxes on the Fidelity Checklist. If there's even a single box that has not been checked, you are not yet prepared to facilitate this capacity assessment with a group of people.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring us back. It's 4:45. We have about 45 minutes left together, and I do want to make sure that you have time in some of your home groups to sort of decompress and talk amongst each other as needed. So up until this point, Andrea and I have really focused all of our presentations around, tools, infographics, graphic organizers, things that you can sort of add to your toolbox when thinking about the curriculum that you're using, the screening tools that you're using, the staff that you have available, in ways to support your teachers and your students that are in your setting. So briefly, we wanted to show sort of a timeline of a Maine school. And this is something that Andrea, and she can explain it better than me, but she worked with a local school district to sort of create this timeline. And COVID happened, and our requirement to not provide any instruction, PD in public schools happened and continues. So some of the work in this timeline has fallen through as far as interaction goes over the course of the last COVID year. However,
yeah, basically everything fell apart.
Yeah, yeah. So Andrea, I mean, you can kind of describe this. I don't know if you can see it or not at your transitioning, but this is a pyramid model sort of visual that this particular district designed for themselves, where instead of starting at a tier 1 level, they added a foundation level. Did you want to?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So one thing that this school, one thing that I really liked about the approach that this particular school took was that they really looked at that exploration phase of implementation science, and they took a solid year to really explore what it was that their school was going to need in order to make their MTSS work as efficiently as possible. And so during that exploration phase, what they really needed to do was they did a ton of work on just like common language and common understanding. And then they really stepped back and said, okay, what is it that our teachers, our people, and our facility needs to be able to do so that we can get our kids accelerated towards the goal that it is that we want them to get to. And so, like Nicole was saying, they actually developed what I would consider to be a 4-tiered model versus what most of us know as an MTSS as a 3-tiered model. And so during that process of coming up with like that common language and that common understanding, they really put in that foundational model, which was, like, what is it that our teachers are going to have and what is it that they need to know? Because without that, you can't possibly have a robust tier 1. And without tier 1, we can't have tier 2 and or tier 3. And we do tend to sometimes jump really quickly up to that tier 3 as a support layer. Nicole, if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide. Okay, and so what you'll see on this screen here is actually the timeline that the school took in terms of their universal screeners. And so what you'll see here is that they have the start of the school year, and then they have the midpoint, which would be that February 15th point, and then they have the end of the year, which is June 7th. But if you take a look, they actually built in 2 additional screener points into their calendar because, again, they wanted their efforts to be as responsive as possible to what was happening. So they broke it down into 8-week chunks versus the 12-week chunks that would be a normal chunk of time for, the beginning of the year and the end of the year. And then during those 8-week chunks, that was where they would do their progress monitoring. They would do, this is where they would insert like their interventions. This is where they were collecting data and really doing that process of figuring out how students were responding to the intervention and the instruction, but also what were the needs that they were finding that the teachers and the educators continued to have during that process. And then instead of waiting a full solid half a year to make changes to that programming, they chunked it down and made it into smaller increments so that they could respond more quickly to things that might have needed more time and effort or some changes done to them. If we take a look at the next slide, so the next couple of slides is really where they did all of their resource mapping. And their resource mapping included everything from the people and the kinds of people that they had available to them. They took a look at their master schedule. They took a look at their facilities, their school map, like where they were going to put different interventions, different programs, who was going to do them. This is where they took a look at all of the different types of programming that they already had in place. So they had 504 programming, and they had special education program, Title I program. They had gifted and talented programming, right? So this is where they took a look at all of their different systems, and they conducted a series of resource mapping. So this is the number of kids that we know that need a tier 2 intervention as of right now. This is the number of kids that we know that need a tier 3 intervention as of right now. This is the number of kids that get this. This is the number of kids that get that. These are the number of staff that we have to provide support X, Y, and Z. And so as Nicole goes through the next couple of slides, you'll see that this is the process of the resource mapping that they took. In order to get to this next slide that you see right here, which is the actual timeline that the school participated in year 0. So this is like their exploration year. This was the point that they were really doing that resource mapping and that really exploring of what it was that they wanted to accomplish through scaling up their response to intervention and MTSS efforts. So you'll see here where, you know, this is like the actual timeline that they followed. So once they had done all of that sort of like collecting of numbers and sorting of numbers and looking at like where it was that their gaps were, where it was that their holes were, they did that, and then they presented to the school board, and they were like, look, this is what we know is best practice. This is the reason behind this. This is the current state that we're in, and this is where we want to go. And so they brought it to their school board to get that process started. And then you can see that from there, they were able to go through a variety of other steps where they had to fill in some different positions. They had to reorganize some different positions, and they really had to look at how they were going to reorganize those resources to get what they wanted. I think we've mentioned in the past that, you know, certainly if something was written in by man, it could be written out by man as well, right? And so this is where they looked for getting that permission to reorganize some of these resources in a way that was going to be more beneficial for them. Now, we realize that not every school is going to have the power or the capability of being able to hire for different people. This particular school was able to reorganize in a way that they were able to bring on some additional staff. There are other things that you can do to get to a similar result by simply shaking around and reimagining some of the job descriptions and the roles of the folks that you have available. And of course, you have to have your school board involved in that process, because if you're changing a job description for someone, that obviously has to be something that happens at the school board level, and not just like, okay, well, I signed you on for this contract, but you're going to do this instead. Oh, no, let's not get into any of that. So we wanted it to be, you know, legal and legit and able to be sustainable as they moved forward. So they went ahead and got their local school board involved as well. So you can take a look at that timeline to see exactly what process it was that they took throughout the first part of that year 0. Move on to the next, Nicole. Okay, so this is just another example of a staffing distribution and priority chart that they did. So this is where they actually looked at who and what based on the different levels of schooling and the different areas of accountability, in this case, mathematics and literacy. You can go on to the next, Nicole. And then this is just another example of how they were going to distribute the resources, and in this case, primarily distributing the people, and then distributing them by their role, their expertise, and then which already standing program that they had in place that they needed to have people staffed at, right? So there's like that tier 3 504, there's like general education literacy, general education mathematics, and of course there are gifted and talented approaches as well. Go ahead on to the next one. And then this is just where they filled in that chart, right? So that was the example of the blank chart. And then this was how they filled it in based on what they knew they had available to them at that time. Move on to the next. Okay, so now this is just another example of an organizational tool that they used. And you'll notice that these items are slightly different than the items on the other organizational tool. So this is where they started looking at some additional resources, such as their instructional coaches and strategists, ed techs, any e-learning programs that they had. So if you're thinking about like Alex or Lexia or any of those other programs that could be considered instructional, that could be used as an intervention that didn't need like a body to instruct that particular program at that time. On to the next. And then of course, here is another example of what that looks like filled in based on the numbers that they had. All right, and then this should look pretty familiar to most of you that have been with us since the beginning, because what you see here is where they took those programs and practices and actually designated them into the tier where they felt that that program could have the most impact, right? So they broke it down into tier 1, tier 2, and then tier 3. What you'll notice here is that special education doesn't seem to appear in this particular structure, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Now, in a true MTSS system, special education is going to run within those 3 tiers the same way that a general education student would run within those 3 tiers. But for these purposes, they did have specific programs that at that time, so I want to iterate that at the time of the organizing, they had certain programs that they were using specifically for special ed. But like we said a few weeks ago, you would never want to deny access to a particular practice or a program to a group of students that could benefit from it just because it appears in a different tier than the one that they are currently in. So if you do some universal screening and you see that you have a very large population of your second graders, for example, that clearly need some additional literacy work, you certainly wouldn't want to wait for a majority of those kids to get even more behind before pulling in a tier 2 or even a tier 3 intervention, depending on how severe the discrepancy was. So just because a particular practice or intervention appears in a certain spot does not mean it is pigeonholed for that spot. And 9 times out of 10, there will be nothing in the actual directions of that program that will tell you that you can't use it at a different tier, right? That's a decision that's made by people and not by the program itself. And I think the next slide might just be their current special education programs that they had at that time. So I think the big thing to take away here is that as they were finished taking a look at where their current resources were and how they were being used, that as they were getting into the year 1 implementation of their MTSS, they were willing to look at these things and move them around as they needed to provide the best amount of support for the students they were serving.